Welcome back to the Deliberate Leaders podcast. I am your host and executive coach, Allison Dunn. Today, we are going to be discussing the Agile Leader, and I'm super excited to introduce our guest. We have with us Chuck Mollor. He is the founder, CEO, advisor, and executive coach at MCG Partners, which is an organization that helps develop leaders and teams optimizing both business and individual talents. His newest book, The Rise of the Agile Leader, Can You Make the Shift, is a guide for the aspiring mid and seasoned C leader, an executive that introduces a new leadership paradigm, a roadmap of what makes a great leader, and what organizations must do to develop great leaders. Chuck, thank you so much for joining us here today.
I'm thrilled to be here, Allison. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. I love to kick these off with a deliberate conversation. So my question for you is, what would be your number one leadership tip for our listeners?
Number one, let's see, considering the environment we're in right now, I would say pause. We're running hard where everyone's running from one video meeting to the next, trying to figure out virtual versus hybrid workforce effectiveness. Trying to understand the consumers and the global competition, the global marketplace, and the pace of change, the intensity of change. Pause, find time to reflect, find time to think, to plan, to strategize. Don't just get caught up in the moment. That's probably my biggest advice I would give to any leader right now.
Yeah. And that's the first time I've received that tip. And Chuck, I want to tell you that that is a tip that I don't think enough people put enough weight on, and such a powerful way to do it. So I have my own process. Can you talk me through what process you would use to hit pause? Like, what does that look like in your own world? I'm curious.
There are a couple of different things. One is a very simple technique that I use, which really involves a person's calendar, because very often we think we know where we spend our time versus where we actually spend our time. So it's a very simple exercise. I get a client to print out their calendar for about 2 or 3 months and sort of categorize, where they spend their time. Is it, day-to-day meetings with clients, customers, whatever the categories may be, depending what's on your calendar, what your job is, and what your industry is. Everybody comes back shocked, saying, "Oh my God, I thought I was spending my time doing X, Y, Z. The reality is I'm too involved in the day-to-day." And I'm like, okay, do you have any time scheduled for yourself? Well, no, I try, but I always get, overridden, and I end up scheduling something, and I sort of be flexible about that because the demands of, my organization, the demands of my business. So it's really eye-opening exercise for a leader, because they recognize, for the most part, they're too involved in the day-to-day. They're not spending enough time being strategic. They're not spending enough time being external, meaning not just with customers, but looking at the marketplace, looking at competition, looking at the future, what the future holds for our company, our industry. What are those trends? Looking at things like innovation, what's going to disrupt our industry? Are we thinking about disruption? Too many leaders are caught up in the day-to-day. And of course, as we just talked about, they're not spending enough time pausing. They're not spending enough time having a chance to self-reflect, not just to be strategic, but to think about themselves. What am I doing as a leader? What am I doing to make sure I'm developing my people? Am I developing the next generation of leaders? All things that you don't have time to think about when you're, caught up in the day-to-day. And every leader that says, yes, I'm going to get to that, it's like that proverbial, I'm going to get to the gym. It just doesn't happen, right? Because you're, I'll do it in the morning, or I'll do it in the evening, I'll do it in the shower, or I'll do it while having breakfast. No, it just doesn't happen that way. So that's the technique I would advise.
Yeah. I have thinking time as a block on my calendar every single day. And it's when I coach people to do that, it's just a foreign concept. And so Thank you for reaffirming what I've been telling everyone to do. So when you asked me, how was my day going? And I've said, I've had the perfect day, thinking time, which I super appreciate. It just sets the tone. So
agreed.
I love it. So our topic today is the Agile Leader. And I just wanted, just set a baseline. Like what does it mean to be an Agile Leader?
Yeah, and so we're talking about agile, the verb, right? Agile has gained a lot of popularity the last few years because of the actual concept itself came out of software development in terms of trying to increase the cycles of innovation in terms of generating the next software product. So agile methodology, or Scrum as it's known, has been really gaining popularity outside of software development, where a lot of organizations have been thinking about being agile in terms of transforming their organization, being leaner, being a little bit more empowered in terms of decision making, a little bit more flexible. And of course, in terms of the word itself, the vocabulary description, how to be able to be flexible, to be able to shift quickly, to be quick on your feet, right? So think about that in organizations today. And I would say, yes, it's one thing if you're a startup, if you're a fast-growing company and you're young and you're small, it's a little easier to be agile in a lot of ways. When you start getting to be a larger company, especially Fortune 500 or even larger, there's so many different decision-making levels and layers and bureaucracy and processes. And sometimes organizations have to really take a step back and say, do they need to exist? Are we moving quick enough to be able to respond to the needs of the marketplace, to be competitive, address the future growth and innovation of our sector? So it gets a little harder. But innovation from a leadership standpoint, not innovation, excuse me, agile from a leadership standpoint is a little different. What I'm coming from is, I think let's use some very specifics here. You think about the multiple generations in the workforce today and their needs and their perspectives. You think about the focus of being inclusive. And what does that mean for multiple backgrounds in terms of ethnic backgrounds and ages and nationalities and cultural focuses? When you're managing potentially a global workforce that's also most likely virtual or hybrid, so the leader today it's more challenging. It's more difficult, more complex than it's ever been in our modern history, right? When you think about all those factors, then of course COVID just accelerated that the last 2 years. So agile to me is the adaptability of how to pivot and deal with all those complexities, at the same time stay focused on what success is for your business, but also success for your organization and its culture. Because without culture, without people feeling valued, appreciated, saying, I identify with your brand, with what your values are, what's acceptable behaviors, I want to be part of this organization, I want to be part of its future, you're not going to drive performance, you're not going to drive engagement, you're not going to drive retention. Therefore, you're not going to achieve the results you're trying to achieve, both strategically and financially. So agile encompasses a lot of different aspects of what leadership is today.
That was a big definition, but
yes, it was. I captured a lot of different things there, but that's a very macro perspective, and then you can get into some very, very specifics. Yeah.
So let's dive into some of the specifics. In your book, you kind of emphasize how important it is to understand how your team perceives you as the executive and why it matters. Can you kind of enlighten us on that?
Yeah. So when you think about managing in the 80s and the 70s, even let's say the early 90s, most of the 90s, managing was really a very top-down work environment, right? We call it command and control, right? Managers were in charge, they barked orders, and the rest of the organization followed the different levels of managers, and it was very top-down command and control. The world started changing tremendously over the last 20 years. And what we see now is the need for managers to have the flexibility to understand why it's important for their employees to appreciate and value them as managers. So it's a pretty famous study. I'll use this as an example. You probably know that Google did this big study a couple of years ago about what creates a high performing team. In other words, why are some managers very effective and what in the environment they create for their employees versus others? And the number one reason was this whole concept around psychological safety, which essentially is about creating a safe work environment. Not safe in terms of physical safety, but safety in the sense of, can I challenge the status quo? Can I provide feedback to my boss? Can I challenge my colleagues? Can I question why are we doing this or why are we not doing this? So it's about creating an environment where people feel comfortable. Can I fail and make a mistake without losing my job? or getting reprimanded. So when you think about what really safety is and why it's so critical, and it's really the pivot of, as a leader, how I'm seen as a leader. Am I delegating effectively? Am I empowering my people? The expectations of employees and organizations are so different today. It's really, really shifted in the sense that as a leader now, your ability to ask for feedback, to empower your people, to develop your people, to develop next generations of leaders, and where the decision-making has now been pushed down in the organization. Leaders today are more facilitators than necessarily of, I got to be involved in every decision. And frankly, going back to our first conversation, the beginning of this podcast, if you are not getting out of some of those day-to-day decisions, you're not spending enough time being externally focused. So there's a combination of reasons of why this is so important.
Is there a proposed step or process for an executive to find out how they are perceived? Like, what is your tool or your go-to analysis for whether they're succeeding in that factor?
Yeah, I mean, some of these tools have become very standard over the last 10, 15 years, Allison. We all know behavioral assessments in terms of understanding who you are, what your strengths are, but it's also about what happens to you under pressure and stress. What are your derailers? What gets you into trouble? Things very specifically like, how do you deal with conflict? What's your natural decision-making style? How do you deal naturally with risk and change? How do you communicate? So understanding your behavioral self is so critical. And then also the feedback mechanism that most people would use is a 360 assessment, right? Both written and verbal, which is, how am I perceived in that moment? So your behavioral assessment essentially is who you are. The 360 is subjective opinions, a snapshot in time of how you're being perceived versus how you see yourself. And understanding the gaps of, do I see myself both in terms of my strengths as well as my development needs, as my colleagues do. That's my boss, my peers, and my subordinates. So those are the traditional mechanisms. The one thing I think that most leaders simply don't do a good enough job is understanding how to ask for feedback and doing it in a way that's not only authentic, but doing it in a way that's effective. Most of us simply say, hey, give me feedback. And when you make a general statement like that, most people really struggle with, what am I supposed to say? I'm not really sure how to say it. And it goes about creating that right environment. For there to be trust is all based upon relationships and a person feeling, one, you respect my opinion, you want my opinion, you're going to do something with my opinion. Most leaders really struggle with asking for feedback and input in a very effective way, not just for themselves as leaders, but also when it comes to making decisions, for their organization, their business. So the ability to ask for feedback as a leader, to me, is probably one of the biggest opportunities that leaders have today in doing that effectively.
I agree. And I think the process you've outlined, getting it from a 360 standpoint and understanding oneself is huge. It's a great first step. In kind of discussing or opening kind of all the things that are involved in being an agile leader, you suggest that focusing on company culture is critical for the organization's success. I agree, but I would love for you to share why that is.
Yeah, so culture essentially is the environment that you're creating that identifies what you value. And it just goes beyond what you value. And the value translates into very specific behaviors, right? So for example, if one of your values is valuing your employees, I'm just making it up, but most companies have value statements in terms of what they value for their organization. And those values have to translate into very specific behaviors that are observable. And then you need to have HR processes and systems that actually support the ability for employees to get feedback, but also get rewarded and recognized and even promoted based upon their ability to demonstrate those values on a consistent level. So it goes back to the cliche, you got to walk the talk as a leader, because if you don't demonstrate those values and those behaviors, why are you going to expect your employees to? And that's where those value statements are, collecting dust, in a cafeteria or on a conference room wall. Now, why is that important? Because essentially your culture, those values that define your culture, is your brand. It's not just your internal brand, it reflects your external brand. So a really good example would be Patagonia, right? Everybody kind of remembers Patagonia when they first started, and one of their more infamous statements was they had a big sale for their clothing, and they made it very clear they're going to donate most of their proceeds to a cause supporting the environment. And that became not only part of their external brand, but they manifested that into how they define that to why you want to be part of organization's culture. How does that translate to what our values are? So culture is a combination of your internal brand and your external brand that need to be aligned. And it goes back to why you want to work here, why do you want to grow here in your career, why you want to perform here and succeed here. And that translates into successful business and performance, both at the individual level as well as the corporate level. So culture has really been a very, very big focus. I've been speaking about culture heavily the last 2 years because of all the changes due to COVID and the impact of COVID. But culture really is sort of the foundation of who you are, and it reflects your strategy, reflects your purpose, reflects essentially who you are as an organization, as a business, and then translates, as I said earlier, to why you want to be here and why you want to succeed here.
I would say that the agility of how companies handled the ability to go from a remote workforce to then a combination or bringing people back in office has had a huge impact on, well, one, culture, but also the overall success of an organization. So do you have any tips for anyone who may be struggling still, possibly, with this type of shift, not being as agile as needed, on how to do this successfully?
Yeah, I think one of the things you have to go back to, and we talked a little bit about self-awareness and asking for feedback, even outside of a 360, which to me is the biggest gap right now that leaders have. I think we all have some of our own natural biases. And, and a very specific example would be, I know there's plenty of managers and leaders and executives out there that struggle with the fact that if I don't see someone doing their job, I don't know if they're doing their job well or if they're performing at the level I expect. So that's a bias, right? It's like, there's plenty of very successful employees out there that are working virtually or hybrid, that you're not going to be able to see them every day, but you have to manage on activities, progress, and results, not necessarily visual management. So we have to understand our biases and what gets us into trouble, especially the complexities now of a virtual hybrid workforce. We're not always going to see them. The other big challenge I think leaders and managers have right now is how do I create culture? How do I create a team and a trusting team, a high performing team, when we're hiring people virtually, we're onboarding them virtually. They're now part of a team that we're not really developing that traditional relationship, in an office, in a water cooler, let's go grab lunch. So I think managers today need to be more creative in finding opportunities to develop stronger connection with their employees. Another example would be if you're spending all your days in meetings, in virtual meetings, what are you doing just to have ad hoc conversation? Hey, how are you doing?
Right.
What's going on in your life? How are your families doing? What are you struggling with right now? Those are examples of where I think managers need to be really focused on right now.
You kind of put a big spotlight on the concept of psychological safety. And I think that we would both agree that it's a competitive advantage that we need to maximize, right? To be able to have a highly engaged workforce. What are some of your go-to practices that you suggest a company implement?
When it comes to psychological safety or in general?
Creating psychological safety so you can have that type of engagement, that feedback loop, that level of innovation. So outside of the actual feedback itself, like how would you know if you don't have psychological safety? Let's just start with the baseline of that. Like, what are the indicators you don't have it? If you don't, what do you do?
Sure. So a couple of really very good metrics to assess psychological safety, and that a lot of it has employee engagement scores, a lot of employee engagement surveys, or even pulse surveys. And for those who are not familiar with pulse surveys, where you're doing a survey maybe every month or even a couple of weeks, where it's not just about overall appreciation and value, or do you understand the strategy and your role, and all the other questions that pulse surveys and engagement surveys will ask. A lot of engagement surveys have advanced and evolved to where they're asking about trust and feeling valued and feeling, can you challenge? And so understanding the data, getting that kind of feedback from your employees on a very sort of large scale can be helpful. And I think as an individual manager, you have to ask yourself a couple of questions. One, are your people challenging you? Are you receptive to input and feedback, not just on yourself, but on ideas that go beyond your ideas? So there's plenty of indicators where when you're in a meeting and you're asking for feedback and input, and there's silence, you know that you've got a problem. A lot of leaders say, okay, people don't have an opinion. No, everybody's got an opinion, but the reality is, are you creating again a work environment where people feel comfortable that you're receptive to input and feedback? I mean, I'm working with a couple of executives that historically have been more command and control, and frankly have been more intimidating. And it's really hard to overcome that reputation, sort of old tapes of how you're perceived. And even though you may be spending months, if not even a year, demonstrating the right behaviors, all you have to do is stub your toe a few times and people feel like, oh, you're going back to those past behaviors. So establishing trust with people one-on-one is so critical. Demonstrating that you value their thoughts, their opinions, and their perspectives. It's hard to say you have an organizational metric besides engagement surveys, but it really comes down to managers, how they spend their time every day, how they're forcing decision making down to the organization. Another small technique, it's a very simple one, and I recommend this for a lot of managers: rotate your staff meetings. Who's in charge? You don't need to be in charge of everything. If anything, part of your job is to observe, how people are doing. Be a coach. Have a debrief after the meeting. Say, "Yeah, I thought you did a really great job on these 3-4 things, and here's 1 or 2 things that maybe you can work on." And by the way, before you even say that, ask them how they did. Right, so the ability to ask them how they did in that situation. So there's a lot of really small examples and very powerful examples, like rotating who's in charge of a staff meeting, that gives people a chance to really be empowered and not only have a development opportunity, but also an opportunity to also have responsibility. So it goes back to, are you really making all the major decisions? How are you driving decision making down through your organization? Or are all the ideas coming from you? Are ideas coming from other people? So there's a lot of different sort of parameters you can evaluate to be able to see, are you really creating the right work environment or not?
I love the tip, and I call it share the chair, right? Where you're giving up the opportunity to be that person in the hot seat that really has to try to elicit and pull out the input from other people. And it often has a very empowering form of like, wow, that was really hard. Like, being the facilitator is not easy. Or at least that's the experience that I've had. And also it allows people to shine.
Yes.
Which is very cool.
I agree.
Chuck, I just want to make sure that our followers understand how to best find and to connect with you. What would that be?
Sure. Probably the best way would be, going to one of my 2 websites, which is mcgpartners.com, or I have my own website, which really reflects the book, which is chuckmollor.com, and that's MOLLOR. That'd be the best way to reach me. Yeah.
Fantastic. I will put those in the show notes, and I also am going to put a link to your new book. So congratulations on the book.
Thank you so much.